What do you make of this subdued reaction, and what does it say about not just our relationship, but any potential or lack of change in policy that this might bring?
Well, Iran policy in the United States has been problematic for some time because we actually don't have an Iran policy, believe it or not. We've had three big events: the war in Ukraine, the Women Life Freedom Uprising, and the October 7th attack that Iran has been involved in. And we haven't seen any change in U.S. policy. And, you know, we just heard that statement. And a lot of Iranians are saying, well, why are you even giving any empathy for this regime that has blood on its hands and has done so much to its people? We want this regime gone. And that's been a lot of the reaction on social media.
Okay, so to that point, we're not seeing changes in U.S. policy. Are we about to start seeing changes in Iranian policy now that he has died? Or is it status quo with someone else?
Well, I think that's an important point. I think the key here is that domestic and foreign policy decisions are made by the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader. And with Ebrahim Raisi gone, there's still going to be continuity because the main decision maker is still alive, and that's Khamenei himself. So I wouldn't expect any changes.
That's the point here, right? When you don't see that much of a reaction, it's an indication of status quo. Not that much is likely to change here. We already likely know who will be replacing him when elections are held in 50 days or so forth. But Raisi had a special relationship with Saudi Arabia. It's something that we were talking about earlier. And I wonder if this has any impact on the potential for normalizing relations with Saudi Arabia and Israel, something that seemed to be at hand.
Well, I think, again, this goes back to the big picture. The president of the Islamic Republic is the face. He's the head of state that travels, that does all the meetings and does all the foreign policy decisions, along with the foreign minister, who also just died in the helicopter crash. But at the end of the day, it's the supreme leader, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, that are making these decisions. So you're going to still see that these policies with Saudi Arabia, this normalization that's happened in the past year, after China had brokered this deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So you're not really going to see much changes. I think what's key here to note about Raisi himself is that he was a top contender for the role of supreme leader. So what you might see is this change in the succession line. Who's going to be next? This is an individual that was molded by the supreme leader himself. He was a loyal servant to the supreme leader. And so who will be in line next? And that's really the question for some of us analysts.
Do you have any ideas as to who that may be?
Well, that circle has gotten much smaller now after yesterday's events. Another candidate that some people have floated around is Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the supreme leader, who works in the shadows. But that would mean that the Islamic Republic would be a hereditary model, and that would make it no different than the monarchy that had been overthrown in 1979.
What type of reaction should we expect to hear, if any, from the people of Iran? Could this draw protests as we work our way towards an election?
Well, I think it's noteworthy that Iranians were actually celebrating this news. There were a lot of memes on social media that were highlighting this. Everything from hoping that wild animals would actually maul to death or kill the president or foreign minister. I know that's very morbid, but I think that should just highlight how angry and discontent they are with the Islamic Republic. We've also seen people cheering and dancing and posting these videos online. It's really hard to say, but I think this was a headache that the Islamic Republic did not want. They just had recent parliamentary elections that had the lowest turnout in the country's history. So I think that it's going to be a somewhat of a rough ride for them that they would like not to happen.
Well, especially because it's one thing to consider how rough the ride may be domestically, but also considering the neighborhood isn't exactly riding easy right now, as you've seen spill out into a way that we have not actually really seen in recent years in public in terms of actual assaults. Iran going after Israel, Israel going after Iran, a lot of activities in terms of the proxies, not just Hamas, but Hezbollah and obviously the Houthis in the Red Sea. What changes about all of that activity, if anything?
I mean, if I had a crystal ball, I would say that they'd like to keep it as drama-free as possible. But there's also the possibility, as some analysts were saying, of a wag the dog scenario, like keeping things distracted so that things are calmer on the domestic front. But from what we're seeing is that they're going to be focusing on how to make this presidential election as drama-free as possible, making sure that there's the right contender and that that situation on the ground with the populace that's very discontent with the regime is kept at ease.
There were initial questions, as anyone would expect, about potential Israeli involvement in the downing of that helicopter. Are you impressed in this age of misinformation and 24-hour news cycle that was brought to an end as quickly as it was? What do you think about that?
Well, I think that it was not surprising at all to hear that Israel intelligence agency Mossad would be blamed, especially you would think that that would be something common with the Islamic Republic, who likes to blame the United States and the West, and by extension Israel, for everything that goes wrong in their country. But I think the reality is that there were two things at play. First was that the helicopter was very old. Because of sanctions, the Islamic Republic has not been able to replace the parts on some of these old helicopters. But more importantly, they were flying in dense fog. So one wonders, well, who made that decision to let the president and foreign minister fly in such adverse weather conditions? So I'd be curious to see what they're going to do about that.
Yeah, certainly we still have a lot of details left to learn in that regard, I'm sure. Just finally, as we take kind of the wider view here of ultimately if it is going to be largely status quo, prior to his death, we were talking about a time where the U.S. and Iran clearly are not in the best area in their relationship. If a new president comes in, knowing that Ayatollah ultimately will still be in charge, it will still be the supreme leader who has the end say in everything, does this actually change the calculation of, say, a return to some kind of nuclear, not deal like we saw in prior administrations, but some kind of monitoring, these other kind of wider international efforts that had been underway in the past?
Well, I think the key here is that Khamenei is thinking about succession. He wants a relatively young and pious government. He wants it to be consolidation of power, and that's been a more hardline stance. And so a deal any sort is not realistic at all, because they've recognized that a deal with the United States means that a possible withdrawal. And with a U.S. election coming up, that's not a gamble they're willing to take. And they've also been leaning towards Russia and China. So I think that whatever relationship they were hoping to have with the West during the years of the JCPOA won't be able to coexist anymore, because they saw what happens when they do.